What is up, people? Dunna here, and today we're gonna try and do something fun with this, the Osmo Action from DJI using the PolarPro ND filters. But first, I'm gonna do something that's probably a terrible idea. I need to drive to work to pick up a package, and one of my favorite things to do with the Osmo Action are driving time lapses. Now, up until now, I've always hooked up the Osmo Action inside my vehicle, which is nice, it's safe there and everything, but if there's any kind of debris on your windshield, it's a little bit tough to get a really nice picture. So what I want to do today is actually hook up using this suction cup onto the hood of my van here, see how that goes. Like I said, probably a terrible idea. I'm trying to decide where I think this should go. There are kind of two places, right in between the windshield wipers, or, oh, that's a good stick, or right down on the hood of the car. I'm thinking I'd probably feel better if it was up between the windshield wipers, because that way I can kind of use the windshield wipers to sandwich it in. This is a terrible idea. I feel really bad about this. It's got a pretty good hold though. Here's hoping. If you've ever seen the Osmo Action before, you might be noticing that there's something a little bit different about this one, and that's because this video is sponsored by PolarPro. PolarPro makes filters, and they've got a filter set made specifically for the Osmo Action. But we're gonna talk about that later because I'm really nervous and I wanna get this over with. Rip the Band-Aid off and drive to work and hope that this doesn't fall off of my vehicle and ruin it forever. Okay, this is the moment of truth. I've got the app all hooked up. It's on the hood of the car. I feel really not good about this, but here we go. I'm gonna start the time lapse. We made it, and it's still there. Genuinely so happy that it didn't fall off and get crushed on the road. Now, I've had the Osmo Action for a little while now, and action cams are pretty cool because of the unique things that you can do with them. They fit in super tiny spaces, and you can mount them on pretty much anything, which opens up a lot of possibilities. But there are also some limitations. For example, the Osmo Action has a fixed aperture of f2.8, so you can't use aperture to adjust your exposure. I have a whole video talking about the exposure triangle and how to properly set your exposure. I'll link that up here if you want to check it out. But what I really want to talk about specifically today is motion blur, which is controlled by shutter speed. All said and done, there are two main things that I use my action camera for. The first one is to shoot video in places where I might not be able to shoot video with my normal camera, and the second thing is to shoot those time lapses like I was showing you in the car. First, let's talk about video, and we'll get to the time lapses a little bit later. When I'm shooting video, I typically try to adhere to the 180-degree shutter rule. What that means is whatever frame rate I'm shooting at, I want my shutter speed to be approximately double. So for example, if I'm shooting at 24 frames per second, that means each frame takes up 1/24th of a second. So I want to set my shutter speed at 1/48th of a second. Because there is no 1/48th of a second option on a lot of cameras, I'll set it to 1/50th. And then on the Osmo Action, if I'm using their 60 frames per second 4K, I'll be trying to shoot at 1/120th of a second, and so on and so forth. The reason that this is important is because it gives pleasing motion blur. Each frame is a picture, and if there's something moving through the frame, depending on how slow the shutter speed is, it will blur more or less. In video, if you have too fast of a shutter speed, things can look sharp and jittery, but shutter speed is also one of the ways that we adjust our exposure or brightness of our image. A faster shutter speed means a darker image, and a slower one means a brighter image. So if our shutter speed is locked down to keep with that 180-degree shutter rule, we're gonna need another way to adjust exposure. And like I said before, on action cameras, it's often a fixed aperture, so you can't use that to adjust for exposure either. And yes, we do have ISO that we can make things brighter with, but if it's already bright out, we're gonna need to use ND filters. In this shot, I'm filming at 24 frames per second, and ideally, I'd like to have my shutter speed at either 1/48th or 1/50th of a second, but I've had to bump it all the way to 1/1600th of a second just to get the exposure right. If I was to change it down to 1/50th of a second, it would look like this. Basically, it looks like white. Now, if you do a little bit of quick math, you might be able to figure out that 1/50th of a second and 1/1600th of a second are exactly 6 stops of light difference. So I'm gonna put an ND filter on there. We're still at 1/50th of a second, we're still at ISO 100, but we put a 6-stop ND filter on there, and now we get the proper exposure. Until the sun comes out and ruins everything. So as you can see, when shooting video on the Osmo Action, having ND filters can be the difference between having janky looking amateur footage and having awesome looking cinematic professional footage. But there are a couple of things that really make the polarpro filter stand out. First of all, the quality is super high like all polarpro products. If you've ever heard me talk about my Peter McKinnon variable ND filters made by polarpro, or Pumvund as I like to call them, you'll know how much I love those things and how I love the quality of them. It's that same polarpro build and image quality that you've come to expect from them. But what I really love about them is the way that you actually mount it. They've come up with this cool new system. When you get the Osmo Action, it comes with this clear protective part that we're just gonna take straight off. And instead of making the ND filters the same and having to screw them on and off each time, they gave you this, a little magnetic ring that you can screw on. And that just stays on there nice and snug. Now when I'm ready to put on a filter, just snaps into place. And it holds pretty securely too. If I want to put another one on, pull that one off, snap another one into place with no screwing on and off like you would have to do with normal filters. The entire range of ND filters and ND polarizing filters go from 2 to 6 stops, and there are a bunch of different packages depending on exactly what you need. NDs are great if you just want to make things darker, and the polarizing filters are kind of cool because they'll actually cut reflections. So if you're trying to look through glass or water, that can be really helpful, or even if you're looking at a nice blue sky, it'll make it a nice vivid blue. I'd love to show you, but it's pretty cloudy out. Oh, maybe there's a patch of blue. So as I turn the polarizer, you'll see it change. But Donna, how can we use this motion blur in these ND filters to make our time lapses look cooler? Well, I'm really glad that you asked, Steve. The concept is pretty much the same as when we're shooting video. I mean, it is a video in the end, but in my opinion, you can take it way further when you're doing time lapses. And the reason is because we're speeding up motion so much, I feel like the blur should also be accentuated. I love to use anything from like 1/30th of a second, even down to 1/10th or 1/5th of a second if I can. Here's another example of a car time lapse, but this time I didn't use an ND filter, so I had to set the shutter speed at 1/1600th of a second. You can see how sharp and jittery everything looks. Now compare that again to when I put another ND filter on and I cut it back to 1/30th of a second. Everything in the center of the frame feels like it's kind of in focus, but all the stuff on the sides is kind of blurring by. And in my opinion, that makes it way cooler. And again, because there are limitations with cameras, and specifically with the action camera having the fixed aperture, you're gonna need ND filters if you want to accomplish that. If you're interested in trying any of this out yourself and you want to take a look at the Osmo Action polarpro filter kits, I'll leave links in the description. And as always, I want to hear from you guys. Leave a comment below and let me know, what would you do with the Osmo Action ND filter kit? Do you have any cool and unique ideas that you would use these filters for? And on your way down there, hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks again to polarpro for sponsoring this video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.